A room full of men laughed at her, not cruelly, just the soft, pitying laugh of people certain they are watching someone make the last mistake of her life. She had nothing left. A dead man's debts had taken her home, her land, every last thing she owned. And now she stood at a worn counter, sliding her final coins across the wood to buy the one piece of ground in the whole valley that nobody dared to touch. The cursed place, the haunted place, where the water glowed a strange and silent blue in the dark, where livestock would not graze, where owners came and fled. The laughter faded as she spoke, quiet, steady, unafraid. If that place is truly haunted, then it can't take much more from me than life already has. And she turned, and she walked toward it. Rain came down on the wagon road like it had something to settle. It hammered the ruts until they ran like little rivers, brown and cold, carrying the day away into the dark. And somewhere out past the bridge, where the water ran fast and the stones were slick, a wheel gave out. Then the axle. By the time the gray light crept over the hills, a man named Silas Ashby was gone. The news of it reached the house before his body did. That was the first cruelty. The second came 3 days later. The creditors arrived the way crows arrive, one after another, quiet at first, then bolder. A woman stood on her own porch and watched them come up the road, and she did not move, and she did not speak. Her name was Cora Ashby. She had buried a husband she was still learning the truth about. The first man took the milk cow. He didn't look at her when he led it away. He just wound the rope around his fist and walked, and the cow followed, lowing into the wind, and the sound of it carried back across the yard like something mourning. The second took the plow. The third loaded the tools into a wagon without a single word, as if words might cost him something he wasn't willing to pay. And Cora just stood there. She watched every piece of her life leave the yard. The notes were real. That was the worst of it. Gambling debts, scrawled out in some smoky back room, signed in her husband's own hand. She knew that hand. She had read it on letters once, long ago, when it still wrote tender things to her, when it still made promises. Now it wrote her ruin. The signature belonged to a dead man, but the loss belonged to the living. By the end of the month, the house was gone. The pasture was gone. Even the good rocking chair on the porch, the one that creaked in just the right place, the one she had sat in through 1,000 long evenings, that was gone too. $15. That was what remained of a whole life. $15, folded soft and small, tucked deep into the pocket of her coat, where her fingers could find it in the dark. And one more thing. Out past the empty fence line, standing patient in the mud, was an old mule named Boone, gray around the muzzle, slow in the hips, worth almost nothing to a man counting coins, which was exactly why no one had bothered to take him. Cora looked at that mule for a long moment. Then she pulled the front door closed behind her. The latch clicked. And just like that, the house wasn't hers anymore. Neither was anything inside it. Not the windows she had washed until they shone, nor the worn place on the floor where she always stood to knead her bread, nor the corner where a marriage had begun, years before, with so much hope it had felt like a sunrise. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private, in the dark, where no man with a wagon could ever see. She just turned. She took hold of the lead rope. And she walked. There is a kind of woman the world likes to write off. A woman past her bloom. A woman without a man at her side. A woman with no money and no land and nothing in her pockets but lint and a few thin folded bills. The world looks at a woman like that and decides it already knows how her story ends. The world is so often wrong. It just doesn't stay around long enough to find out. She came into a small valley town with that mule and those $15 and no place left on this earth to lay her head. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of town where they knew her trouble before she had even hitched the mule to the rail outside. She could feel it as she walked the street. The way the talking stopped, just a little, then started up again. The way eyes followed her, and then slid away when she turned to meet them. A widow with nothing. They had decided what she was before she had said a word. The land office sat beside the general store, low and weathered under a gray sky. Inside, a potbelly stove ticked and crackled against the morning cold, and a handful of men stood near it the way men do, warming their hands, warming their opinions. Behind the counter, a thin clerk named Eldon Pratt opened a heavy ledger. He ran one finger down a yellowed page, slow, like he was looking for something he hoped he would not find. "There is one place left," he said. He turned the book around so she could see it. 3 acres, $15. 15. The exact and perfect shape of everything she had in the world. She looked at the number for a long moment, and something inside her went very still and very quiet. The men by the stove went quiet too. Then, quiet in a different way. A waiting kind of quiet. One of them shifted his weight from one boot to the other. "You're talking about the haunted farm," he said, low, almost a warning. The way a man speaks the name of something he would rather not name at all. Eldon Pratt didn't answer him. He didn't have to. The whole valley knew the place. It sat at the far end of everything, under a pale limestone bluff, in a narrow hollow that nobody wanted and nobody could quite explain away. For more than 20 years, owners had come and gone. Some had lasted a season. Some had lasted only weeks. Livestock wouldn't graze near the bluff, folks said. On cold mornings, white mist rose up out of the ground and hung there, long after the rest of the valley had cleared and warmed. And on certain nights when the moon hung just right in the sky, the light would come down and strike a narrow spring below the rocks and turn the whole hollow a strange and shimmering blue, silver and blue, like something that did not belong to the waking world. Stories grew in the spaces where facts should have been. People spoke of footsteps in the fog, of voices riding on the wind, calling words that no one could quite make out. Mothers warned their children to stay clear of that end of the valley, and the children, being children, made the stories worse with every telling. No buyer in his right mind would touch the place. It just sat there, empty, waiting, year after year. Eldon Pratt looked up from the page, and his eyes were not unkind. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Ashby?" There was real gentleness in the question. The man was not mocking her. He was offering her a door, a way back out. But Cora did not take it. She looked down at those $15 in her hand, the last of absolutely everything. And the whole room seemed to lean in close and wait to see what a broken woman would do. She set the money on the counter. A coin rocked once, twice, then settled flat against the wood, and one of the men by the stove laughed. Now it was not a cruel laugh. That is the thing folks always forget when they tell this story later, in years to come. It was the soft, almost pitying kind of laugh that people make when they believe they are watching someone walk straight off a cliff with her eyes wide open. The laugh of men who are very sure they know better. The clerk hesitated before he reached for the bills, as if touching them would make it real, would make it somehow his fault. Cora folded the deed and slid it into her coat, into the very place where the money used to be. Then she said something. She said it quietly. She did not raise her voice. She never did. If that place is truly haunted. She lifted her eyes and she looked at each one of those men, slow, one at a time. Then it can't take much more from me than life already has. The laughter stopped. It just stopped. Because there was nothing in those words that a man could laugh at. There was only the plain and terrible truth of them. A few moments later, she was back outside in the cold. She took up the lead rope. The old mule lifted his head and looked at her. And she started walking toward the one farm in the whole valley that not a living soul wanted. The men watched her go from the window. Not one of them said a word. The road out followed the edge of the town for a while, past fences and wood smoke, past the warm yellow windows of other people's homes and the smell of other people's suppers cooking. And then it left all of that behind. It thinned. It roughened. It climbed up into a rough country that had never been tamed and did not seem to want to be. Boone pulled along steady through the mud, the way old mules do, like they have long since made their peace with the distance. Cora walked beside him with one hand on the rope and the other tucked deep in her coat against the wind. And the farther she got from that town, the more she found herself thinking of her aunt, a woman named Hazel. Years and years ago, Aunt Hazel had been known all across that part of the country for her gardens. Not because they were the biggest. They never were. They were known because they lived. When everyone else's gardens died, drought would come, and Hazel's rose stayed green. Blight would sweep through, and Hazel's plants simply shrugged it off and kept on. Folks called it luck. Folks called it a gift from above. Hazel just called it paying attention. She never once trusted a rumor about a piece of land. Not in her whole life. She trusted what she could see with her own two eyes. The color of a leaf. The smell of the soil right after rain. The way water chose to move across the ground once a storm had passed and gone. When Cora was a girl, small enough to sit right down in the dirt without anyone minding, she would watch her aunt kneel beside a garden row. Hazel would scoop up a handful of soil and crumble it slow between her fingers, thoughtful, careful, like she was reading a letter that only she could see. Most people, Hazel said to her once, look at the crop. She let the dark soil sift down through her fingers and fall. They ought to be looking at the ground underneath it. She taught that girl things most folks never learn in a whole lifetime. That healthy soil breathes. That the insects will tell you a plant is sick long before the plant ever will. That every season leaves its clues scattered around, little signs and hints, if a person is only patient enough to gather them up and read them. But there was one lesson that Hazel spoke more than all the rest. She said it so many times that the words wore a deep groove into the girl's memory, deep enough that all these long years later, a grown woman walking a cold and muddy road could still hear them, as clear as a bell ringing across water. The land always tells the truth. Hazel would rap her knuckles against the ground when she said it. Tap, tap, like she was knocking gently on a door. The trouble is, and here she would smile that sly, knowing smile of hers. Most folks never stopped talking long enough to hear it. In Cora's coat pocket, beside the deed where the money used to be, was a small tin box. It had belonged to Hazel. Inside it were seeds, just ordinary seeds, pumpkin and bean and corn. The very same crops anyone in the valley might think to plant. When the creditors came and stripped the house down to the bare boards, they took the cow and the plow and the rocking chair and the very windows out from under her hands. But they did not get this box. She had hidden it. She had held it back. She had decided somewhere deep down that she would sooner go hungry than ever let it go. Now, on the road, she touched it through the cloth of her coat. The metal was cold, but somehow it steadied her hand. It was the last thing left in the world that connected her to a time when she had been loved and taught and certain of her place. She held on to it like an anchor. Ahead, beyond the rolling hills, sat a farm that the whole valley feared. And Cora Ashby was not thinking about ghosts. She was thinking about what Aunt Hazel had always told her, that stories were not evidence, that a rumor was not a fact, no matter how many mouths repeated it, and that the patient and honest land would tell her the truth in the end, if only she had the courage to stop and listen. She intended to listen. She had nothing left to lose by trying. By late afternoon, the road simply ended. There was no grand sign to mark the place, no gate standing proud. The track just gave up and faded into the weeds, the way roads do at the very edge of the world. And there it was, the haunted farm, alone beneath the bluff, in the long gold light of a falling sun. Time had not been gentle with it. The fence posts leaned at crooked, drunken angles. Whole stretches of rail had collapsed down into the weeds and been swallowed up by them. The cabin sagged a little to one side, like an old man too tired to stand up straight any longer. Like it had been holding itself together, all alone, for far too many years, and had finally just stopped trying to look brave about it. Cora stopped at the broken gate. For a long moment, nothing moved at all. The wind dropped. The light hung still and golden over everything, over the ruined fence and the tired cabin and the tall dead weeds. And then she saw it. At the base of the bluff, where the pale stone met the dark earth, a narrow spring came out of the rock. Clear water slipped down over the limestone and gathered, soft and slow, into a shallow basin below. The very last of the sunlight struck the surface at a low angle, and the water turned silver, then blue, that same strange, shimmering color the whole valley had built all its fear around. A thin ribbon of mist hung just above it, not thick, not ghostly, just enough to make the place feel set apart from the ordinary waking world. Cora stood very still and looked at it, and so did the mule beside her. Then Boone did something she did not expect at all. All the stories said the same thing, that animals would not go near that water, that they knew better, that a beast could sense the wrongness of the place in its bones and shy away. But the old mule had not heard the stories, or if somehow he had, he did not believe a single word of them. He walked straight toward the spring, slow and sure, his long ears soft and easy, his gray head dropping low toward the water. And he drank, long and deep, the way a tired creature drinks at the end of a hard and endless road. Cora watched him for a good long while. The water that was supposed to be cursed, the animal that was supposed to turn and flee from it. And for the first time, standing there in that gold and silent hollow, a thought moved through her like a slow, cool wind. Maybe the whole valley had been afraid of the wrong thing all along. She crouched down beside the basin. She did exactly what Hazel had taught her all those years ago. She used her own 2 senses, and not the borrowed fear of others. She leaned in close and breathed it in. There was no sulfur, no rot, none of the swampy stink of water gone bad and standing. She studied the surface in the low light. Nothing floated there. No oily sheen, no scum gathered at the cold edges. Just clean water, sliding over pale stone, the way it had likely done for 1,000 years and more, long before anyone with a frightened heart ever came along and gave this place a frightened name. She dipped her hand into the flow, cold, clear, ordinary. She knelt there a few minutes longer, just watching the water move. Then she made a decision that the men back by that warm stove would have called pure madness. She cupped both of her hands together. She lifted the water up to her lips, and she drank. The first swallow tasted of stone and of nothing else at all. Cold all the way down. Then she waited. She sat back on her heels in the fading light, there beside the basin, and she simply waited to see. 1 minute. 5. 10. The bluff stood quiet above her. The spring kept up its low and endless murmur. The mist drifted, thinned, and drifted again. And nothing happened. No sickness rose up in her. No curse took hold of her bones. No voice came drifting out of the fog to claim her for its own. There was only the sound of water moving through ancient rock, the way it had moved long, long before anyone in that valley ever learned to be afraid of it. Cora let out a breath she had not even known she was holding. She was still alive. And against everything, against all of it, she was finally home. The days that followed settled into work, and there is a mercy in honest work, for a heart that has nowhere else to put itself. Boone hauled fallen timber from the edge of the property, dragging it slow through the weeds while Cora walked behind, guiding him, steadying the load with her own hands. She gathered stone from the hillside, one cold, heavy load at a time, and she packed it into the gaps in the cabin wall where the wind had been whistling through. She found boards down in an abandoned shed by the creek, gray and warped, but sound enough, and she carried them up the hill one by one and laid them across the worst of the broken roof. Each fix was a small thing, a patched wall, a few good boards, a door that hung straight again and latched the way a door should. But small things add up. Hazel had taught her that too. A whole garden, she used to say, is nothing more than 1,000 small things, done in their right order, done with care. By the end of that first week, smoke rose from the chimney once again. For the first time in many long years, that old cabin breathed. At night she sat beside a modest little fire, with the spring murmuring just beyond the window glass. That sound never once stopped. Through the deep dark, through the wind, through the long, slow, lonely hours before the dawn, when grief likes most to come calling at a person's door. The haunted farm did not feel haunted. Nothing scratched at the wood. Nothing moved out in the fog. Nothing rose up to chase her off the land she had bought with the last few coins to her name. There was only the water, and the fire, and the deep and gentle quiet. One evening, after a thin supper of beans and cornbread, she stepped outside under a sky filled with hard, bright stars. The spring caught a little of that starlight and gave it back, pale and faint, down below the bluff. Boone stood nearby in the dark, a great patient shape, content in a way she was only just beginning to understand for herself. And Cora felt something rise up in her chest that she had not expected to ever feel again. Not after the wagon road, not after the creditors and their wagons, not after the long, cold walk out of a whole life she had been so sure she would keep forever. Peace. Just that. Plain and whole and quiet. She stood out there a long, long time in the cold and the silver starlight, beside a mule and a spring and a sagging little cabin at the very end of the world. And that night, for the first time since a man had died out in the rain and left her with nothing in this world but his debts, she slept the whole night through. She did not wake even once. The next morning, the light came in soft and gray, and Cora carried Aunt Hazel's tin box over to the rough cabin table. She opened the lid. She spread the contents out across the worn wood. And anyone who had come hoping for some great secret would have walked away disappointed. There were no rare seeds in that little box, no mysterious heirloom kind, no fabled magic thing passed down in whispers. Just the same plain crops the whole valley grew: pumpkin, bean, corn. And that, she thought, looking down at them in the soft morning light, that was exactly right. Because if there truly was something different about this place, something the valley had been far too frightened to ever once look at straight, then the proof of it could not come from anything fancy or rare. It had to come from the plainest, most ordinary plants in all the world. The same seeds that anyone could buy or beg or save, planted by the same two hands. If they grew different here, on this cursed and laughed at ground, then it was the land itself that was speaking, just exactly as Hazel had always sworn it would. Cora gathered the seeds back gently into the box and closed the lid, soft, the way a mother tucks in a sleeping child. Outside, the spring was still running. It had been running all night long. It would keep on running, long after she had gone in to start her day. She looked out the window toward the pale bluff and the thin silver thread of water beneath it. The very thing the whole valley had spent a generation calling a curse. And she felt, for the very first time, the faint and foolish and stubborn beginnings of hope. She did not yet know what waited for her in that water. She did not yet know that men would lie about it, that a rich and powerful man would come to covet it, that a whole valley would turn its back on her, and then come crawling back again when the need grew great enough. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only one thing. The thing her aunt had pressed into her, like a seed pressed into soil, long ago, in another garden, in a gentler time. The land would tell her the truth, in its own slow season. She only had to be quiet enough and patient enough to hear it. She set the tin box up on the windowsill where the morning light could reach it and warm it. Then Cora Ashby rolled up her sleeves, and she went out to listen. Spring came slow to that hollow. It came the way a frightened thing comes. A little at a time, testing the air before it trusts the light. But it came, and when the ground had thawed enough to take a blade, Cora Ashby walked out into the cold morning with Aunt Hazel's tin box held against her chest, and she began. She did not plant the way other folks planted. Other folks dug their rows wherever the digging was easiest, and they trusted to luck and weather and prayer. Cora trusted to none of those things. She trusted to a question, and the question was simple. Was it the water, or was it her? So she made 2 gardens. That was the heart of it. 2 gardens, side by side, asking the same question in 2 different voices. The first she laid out down low, close to the silver blue spring, where the soil stayed dark and a little damp even after a string of dry afternoons. The second she set farther up the slope, on higher ground, where the dirt looked like ordinary valley dirt, and the rain was all the water a plant could hope for. Then she did the careful thing. The thing Hazel would have done. The same seeds went into both. The same week. The same depth, measured with her own finger against the cold black earth. The same spacing, stepped off heel to toe down every single row. Because Hazel had told her, long ago, kneeling in another garden in a kinder time. People love to blame luck for a difference they were just too lazy to measure. Cora measured everything. She would not give the valley one single thing to laugh at. When the planting was done, she walked the rows one last time in the falling light. Boone followed along behind her, the way he always did now, stopping here and there to pull at a patch of grass along the broken fence. She carried water from the basin up to the lower plot, bucket by heavy bucket, until her arms ached and her back sang. The upper plot she left to the sky, to the rain, and to whatever the soil up there could hold on its own. And as the sun slid down behind the pale bluff, the 2 gardens looked exactly alike. 2 patches of bare brown earth, 2 questions planted in the ground. By the end of summer, she suspected, they would tell her 2 very different stories. She had no idea yet just how different. The first shoots broke the soil down by the spring. They came up early, earlier than anything had any right to, earlier than the upper plot by days. And for a little while, Cora let herself believe. She walked the lower rows in the morning fog, and she felt something dangerous and warm rising in her chest. She felt like she had been right. Like the laughing men back in town had been wrong, every one of them, and the proof was already pushing green and tender up out of the cursed ground. That feeling lasted about a week. Then the bean plants began to die. It started small. It always starts small. A few young leaves curled inward, the way a hand curls when it's cold. A few stalks lost their good, healthy green and went pale and sickly along the edges, like something was drawing the life out of them from the inside. And then one whole section of seedlings, down in the very heart of the spring plot, simply stopped growing, stopped reaching, just held still in the dirt, neither living nor quite dying, frozen halfway to nothing. Cora knelt in that row in the gray dawn and felt the warm thing in her chest go cold. She spent the next mornings on her knees among the failing plants. She checked for insects, turning each leaf over with a gentle finger, hunting for the little chewing things, the little sucking things, the signs Hazel had taught her to read. She found nothing. She searched for disease, the spots, the rot, the powder, the wilt. She found nothing she knew. She even dug down around a few of the roots with her bare fingers in the cold morning dirt, looking for some answer hidden under the surface, and she found nothing at all. The plants were dying, and she could not say why. By the end of that week, enough of them were suffering that she could no longer push the thought away. She sat back on her heels in the dirt, and she made herself look the thought straight in the eye. The problem might be her. It might be her own 2 hands. The valley had spent 20 long years blaming the farm, but the valley had lived here 20 years. Cora had lived here a matter of weeks, and it was entirely, painfully possible that she had simply misread the whole thing. That a tired, grieving woman with $15 and a head full of an old aunt's sayings had seen a miracle where there was only mud. That she had been the fool the men by the stove already believed her to be. It would have been so easy, right then, to give up, to decide the curse was real after all, and that the valley had been right, and that she was just one more owner who came and tried and failed and left. But Cora Ashby did not give up. She did something much harder. She kept looking. One afternoon, she carried 2 buckets out into the yard. In the first, water carried up from the silver blue spring. In the second, rainwater, the soft kind, caught in a barrel behind the cabin where the roof drained off. She set them side by side in the light, and she waited. She watched. She let them sit, the way Hazel would have, patient as stone. And slowly, she began to notice a thing she had been walking right past for weeks. When the spring water dried at the edges of the bucket, it left something behind, a faint, pale ring, a whisper of mineral, ghosting the rim where the water had touched and gone. The rainwater left nothing. It dried clean. Cora stood over those 2 buckets for a long, long time, and the whole thing turned over in her mind, slow like soil turning under a blade. The water was not harming her plants. That was not it at all. Too much of it was harming her plants. The spring was rich, full of something the plants loved, something that made them shoot up early and green and eager. But richness, like everything else in this world, could be a kindness or a poison, and the only difference between the two was the amount. She had been carrying bucket after bucket up from the basin, drowning her lower rows in the very thing she thought was saving them, loving them to death. Hazel's voice came to her then, soft and dry, from somewhere far back in her memory. A thing can be good for you, child, and still do you harm if you take too much of it and never stop to think. Cora let out a slow breath, and for the first time in days, she almost smiled. Because a problem you understand is a problem you can fix. It cost her dearly. She tore out the worst of the failing rows. She reshaped the little channel she had dug, so the spring water no longer pooled and soaked and drowned. She mixed it now, spring water and rainwater together, the rich and the plain, until she had something in between. And she replanted. That cost her seed, Hazel's good seed, precious as gold, dropped a second time into the same hungry ground. It cost her near 2 whole weeks of bending and digging and starting over. It cost her the sweet, easy story she had wanted to tell herself, the story where she was simply right, and the magic was simply free. But it bought her something worth far more than all of that. For the first time, Cora understood the truth of the place. The spring was not a miracle, waiting to come and save her. The spring was a resource, a powerful one, a rare one, and like every powerful thing under the sun, it demanded to be respected, or it would turn on the very hands that reached for it. The answer came slow. The land always answers slow. Hazel had warned her of that too. The land does not rush to comfort the worried. A few days passed with no change at all. Then another week. And then, somewhere in the long, warm middle of the season, the replanted rose came back. Not just back, better. And the difference between the two gardens grew too plain to argue with. The corn down by the spring rose up thick and strong. The stalks were sturdier. The green was deeper, a rich, dark green that held its color even through the long, hot stretches that left the upper field looking tired and dusty by noon. Up on the higher ground, the plants were healthy. They were fine. They were everything a decent crop ought to be. But they never quite caught that steady, surging pace of the rows below. The beans told the same story. Down by the water, the vines wrapped their stakes early and just kept climbing, reaching, long after the upper vines had slowed and settled. The leaves came in broad and heavy, casting deep shade over soil that ought to have dried out and didn't. And the pumpkins. The pumpkins were impossible to ignore. Every week, Cora took a strip of cloth and measured them around their middles, the way you might measure a growing child against a door frame. She wrote the numbers down. She wrote everything down in a weathered old ledger she kept on the cabin table, in a hand that grew surer with every page. The rainfall, the hot days, and the cool ones. The day each seed went in, and the day each shoot came up, because Hazel had told her the last and maybe the greatest of all her lessons. Memory is a liar, child. A sweet one, but a liar all the same. Measurements. Measurements don't lie. And as the pages of that ledger filled, a pattern rose up out of the numbers, clear as the spring itself. The upper field was giving her a fine, respectable crop. The spring field was giving her something else entirely, something the valley had never seen. One evening, she carried a bucket up from the basin and stopped beside the largest of the pumpkin vines. The setting sun washed the limestone bluff in gold. Below it, the spring caught the light and threw back its strange pale blue, the way it always had, the way that had frightened a whole valley for a whole generation. Cora stood there between her two gardens, and she let herself think a thought that would have sounded like pure madness only a month before. Maybe the most valuable thing on this whole haunted farm was not the land at all. Maybe it was the spring, the very water the valley had spent 20 years too afraid to touch, the thing they had all walked around and warned their children away from and built their fearful stories upon. It had been sitting here the whole time, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. The secret might have stayed a secret for months. It might have stayed hidden right there in that quiet hollow, in the pages of one woman's ledger, if it had not been for a boy chasing rabbits. His name was Tobias Hart, 14 years old, the son of a man who trapped and hunted the rough country at the edge of the valley, a boy who knew the woods the way other boys knew the streets of town. One morning, he came down along the lower edge of the haunted farm, following a line of snares he'd set near the bluff. He expected what everyone expected: weeds, ruin, empty fields. One more reminder of why no sensible person ever came to this end of the valley. Instead, he stopped dead in the middle of the path. And he stared. Corn stood taller than his waist. Bean vines crowded their stakes, green and thick and climbing. Pumpkin leaves spread out across the ground like great green blankets thrown down over the earth. For a long moment, the boy just stood there with his mouth open and his snares forgotten, and his eyes going wider by the second. Then he saw her, a woman carrying water up from the spring, quiet, plain, unbothered, as if there were nothing in the least bit strange about a paradise growing out of cursed and laughed-at ground. "What in the world," the boy said, "did you do to this place?" Cora glanced across her garden. "Nothing special," she said. The boy looked at the fields again. He did not believe that for one single second. And before the sun was high, Tobias Hart was running flat out, back toward the town, carrying a story the whole valley was about to hear. Stories travel fast in a small place. Within days, folks started finding reasons to pass by the far end of the valley. Some said they were just checking their fences out that way. Some said they happened to be hunting in the area. Most of them said nothing at all, but they came anyway, drawn by the boy's wild tale, certain he had stretched it the way boys always do. He had not stretched it. If anything, he had sold it short. The fields looked even better than he had said. One bright afternoon, a small crowd gathered along the broken fence line of the farm. Men stood with their thumbs hooked into their suspenders, the way men stand when they don't quite know what to make of a thing. Women shaded their eyes against the sun and murmured to one another. Children hung back near the rails, unsure exactly how close to the cursed ground they were allowed to get. And among them, near the front, stood an old man named Amos. Now, if any soul in that whole valley understood the growing of things, it was Amos. He had worked that valley dirt for 50 years and more. He had buried 2 droughts and a hard freeze that folks still talked about. His hands were knotted like old roots, and his eyes had seen every kind of crop the valley could give and every kind it could take away. When Amos spoke about land, people listened. When Amos was quiet, people worried. Cora walked out to him through the rows. She did not say much. She just cut a ripe pumpkin from the vine, a great heavy thing, and she carried it over and set it down in front of him. Nobody spoke. The old man looked at it for a long moment. Then he drew out a worn pocket knife. He sliced away a piece. He turned it in the light. He studied the flesh of it, the color, the firmness, the way a jeweler studies a stone. And then he put it in his mouth, and he chewed. The whole crowd watched him chew. Seconds passed, then more seconds. The old man swallowed. He looked back toward the fields, the impossible fields, stretching green and heavy beneath the pale bluff. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried farther than he meant it to. "I have worked this valley," he said slowly, "for better than 50 years. His eyes moved from the pumpkin in his hand to the rows behind her. "And I do not recall ever tasting a harvest quite like this one." Silence followed, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of people watching a thing they had believed their whole lives begin, very quietly, to crack. For generations, the haunted farm had been a place to point at and warn the children away from. And now, with the sweet taste of fresh pumpkin still on his tongue, old Amos had just handed the whole valley its very first reason to wonder if maybe they had been wrong about it all along. Most folks left the farm that day buzzing about the pumpkins. One man left thinking about something else entirely. He had come late, On purpose, after most of the crowd had gone, he sat his horse at the edge of the property and watched without being noticed, the way some men prefer to watch. His name was Roland Crane, and while everyone else stared at the fields, Roland Crane was looking at the water. Crane owned more of that valley than any other man alive. He owned the largest grain warehouse for a long way in any direction. He owned land he had never even walked. He had spent a lifetime collecting things, the way some men collect things, by waiting and watching and moving in the moment something became worth having. And a long life of collecting had taught him one truth above all others. The most valuable thing in any picture is almost never the thing everyone is looking at. From where he sat his horse, the great green pumpkins were just a symptom. The silver blue spring was the cause. And a cause, Roland Crane knew, was always worth more than a result. He watched the pale water slip down over the rock for a long while. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and rode away. He was a patient man. He could wait. While Crane was learning to want the spring, the farm itself was becoming something new. What had started as 2 gardens, planted to answer a single question, had grown into something much larger. Every overgrown corner found a purpose now. Sorghum went in along the sunniest edges. More corn marched out toward the old dead pasture. Pumpkins sprawled across stretches of ground that had lain empty and forgotten for years. The difference was no longer a thing measured in the neat columns of a ledger. It was measured in wagon loads. Cora began loading the wagon and letting Boone pull it into town. At first, the store owner, a careful man named Harlan Webb, agreed to take just a few loads. A trial. A small gamble. And he made very sure she knew it was only that. But the gamble paid off faster than he could believe. Folks who bought once came back the next day asking for more. Word spread out beyond the valley, the way good word does. Families came in from neighboring settlements. Traveling peddlers loaded their carts. Before long, people were fighting to claim her produce the moment they stepped through Harlan's front door. Sometimes before the wagon from the haunted farm had even rolled into sight, the market was handing down its own plain verdict. And the verdict was this: whatever grew on that cursed ground, the people wanted it. One Saturday, late in the afternoon, Harlan Webb stepped out onto his porch and stood looking at the empty crates lined up against the wall. The last customer had left an hour past. There was nothing left to sell. Not a bean, not an ear of corn, not a single one of those great heavy pumpkins. He reached into the front window, and he hung a small wooden sign there, facing out at the empty street, sold out. It was the first time in all his years he had ever needed such a sign. He stood there a while, looking at it, scratching the back of his neck. And not far off, watching from the shadow of his own warehouse door. Roland Crane saw the sign too. And it was not just the people who noticed the change. There was a woman named Ada, a widow, like Cora, though that was not a thing either of them said out loud. Ada kept bees out on the far side of the valley, and had for many quiet years, and she knew her little winged kingdom the way a mother knows her children. And lately, Ada had noticed something strange. Each morning, more and more of her bees were lifting off and flying the same direction, out and away, toward the far end of the valley, toward the very end no sensible person ever went. Curiosity is a powerful thing, stronger than fear, in the right heart. So one morning, Ada followed her bees. She came to the haunted farm, and she stood at the fence, an old woman in a faded shawl, and she watched her bees do something that stopped her breath. They were flocking by the hundreds, by the thousands, pouring down over the blossoms of the crops that crowded the silver blue spring, drunk and joyful in the rich morning air. By the time autumn came, Ada's honey harvest was the largest she had ever brought in. And the honey itself was different, darker, richer, deeper somehow, with a flavor that customers noticed the very first time the spoon touched their lips. Ada brought a jar of it out to the farm to share with the woman who had, without ever meaning to, changed her bee's whole world. The two widows stood together at the fence, watching the swarm drift glittering over the fields in the autumn light. People, Ada said quietly, turning the jar so it caught the sun, can talk themselves into believing most anything. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. But the bees can't. The bees only know what's true. To Cora, those two things, the empty crates back at the store, and this jar of dark gold honey warm in her hands, were proof. Proof that the farm could finally stand on its own. Proof that she could stand on her own. She had come here with $15 and a dead man's debts and a town full of pitying laughter at her back. And the land had spoken, just as Hazel always swore it would. She had listened, and it had answered. For one bright, golden moment, standing there at the fence with the honey in her hands and the bees singing over her fields. Cora Ashby was happy, but far off, at the very edge of the property, in the long blue shadow of the falling evening. A man on a horse kept his eyes fixed on the pale water sliding down out of the rock. The valley looked at that farm and saw a good harvest. Roland Crane looked at it and saw something else. He saw power. He saw a thing that could change, permanently, who held the future of the whole valley in his hands. And patient men, when they finally decide to move all at once. The first frost had not yet come the morning Roland Crane finally rode out to the haunted farm. Cora saw him long before he reached the cabin. His fine horse came down the wagon track at an easy, unhurried pace, the pace of a man who has never in his life had to rush for anything. Boone stood quiet by the fence line and watched the stranger come. Crane swung down from the saddle beside the garden, and for a few moments he said nothing at all. He just looked at the pumpkins, at the corn, at the heavy bean rows. And then, almost as if he couldn't help it, his eyes drifted down, away from all of it, toward the silver blue spring flowing out beneath the bluff. And that single look told Cora everything she needed to know about the man. Because the people who came for the harvest always looked at the crops first. Roland Crane had come for something else. His offer, when he made it, was generous. Generous by any ordinary measure. He named a figure large enough to buy her another farm and another house on top of it, and still leave money sitting in a bank to draw interest while she slept. It was, in plain truth, more money than Cora Ashby had ever held or hoped to hold in her whole life. She listened to all of it without once interrupting. She let him finish. And then she shook her head. The speed of it surprised him. For just a moment, the polite, easy smile slipped off Roland Crane's face, and something colder showed underneath. He looked past her, toward the water running down out of the rock. "You may not yet understand what you have got here," he said, Cora met his eyes. "I understand enough," she said, "not to sell it." The air between them seemed to cool by several degrees. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he drew on his fine gloves, slow and careful, finger by finger. He glanced once more across the green and thriving fields, and when he turned back toward his horse, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone out of it. "A farm like this," he said, "attracts attention." He paused, one hand on the saddle. "And attention has a way of becoming difficult." Cora said nothing. She had heard threats from men before. She had buried one of them. She stood her ground and watched him ride away, slow and easy, the way he'd come. And behind her, the spring kept right on flowing. But something had shifted in the world. She could feel it, the way you feel the weather turn before the clouds ever show. For the very first time, she understood a hard and frightening thing. The greatest danger to the haunted farm had never been the old stories. The greatest danger was a man who had finally stopped believing them. The change began quietly. The worst changes always do. It began with a word dropped in the right place. A customer in Harlan Webb's store, leaning on the counter, mentioned that he'd heard tell some livestock had taken sick after drinking from that silver blue spring. Nobody could say whose livestock, nobody could say when. But the word was out now, loose in the air. A week later, somebody else said the unnatural harvest was stripping the very life out of the soil, and that the whole place would be a dead and barren waste within a few short years. And then came the older words, the darker ones, the ones the valley had whispered for a generation. The farm was cursed. The spring was unnatural. The valley had ignored the warnings for far too long. And now here was the proof. And they should have known better all along. Nobody could say where the rumors started. That was the worst of it. That was their strength. They had no father, no source, no face to argue with. They simply drifted porch to porch, mouth to mouth, growing a little larger and a little uglier with every single retelling. Cora felt the effect of them before she ever understood the cause. The orders grew smaller. The eager customers who used to come early stopped coming at all. Crates of good produce sat longer than they should have on the store porch, untouched, while the woman who grew them stood by, helpless to understand why. One gray afternoon, Harlan Webb stood beside a row of unsold pumpkins and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't like this," he admitted. He couldn't quite look at her when he said it. Cora didn't like it either, because here was the thing she could not get past, the thing that turned in her mind all the long ride home. The harvest had not changed. The crops had not changed. The spring had not changed one drop. Only what people believed had changed. And that was a far harder thing to fight. Facts a person could measure. Cora had spent a whole season learning to measure facts. But fear could not be measured. It could not be dug up and examined by the root. It just spread in the dark, and you could not fight it with a ledger. On the ride home that evening, Boone pulled the wagon past fields turning gold beneath the lowering sun. The farm behind her was still thriving, still green, still everything she had built it to be. And yet, for the first time since she had walked up that muddy road with the last of her money in her pocket, Cora Ashby found herself wondering whether all her work would be enough. Once before, she had lost everything. lost it through no fault of her own, lost it to another person's choices, another person's failings, signed in another person's hand. And as the wagon wheels turned slow through the dust, an old, cold fear settled back down over her heart. Perhaps it could happen again. But Cora did not yet know the half of it. She did not yet know that the rumors had a father after all, that a patient man in a fine pair of gloves had simply decided to make her attention difficult. And she did not yet know that, very soon, on a cold and ordinary morning, she would walk out to her beloved spring and find the silver blue water running thick and brown and muddy, not from any curse, not from any ghost, but from the work of a human hand in the dark where it thought no one would ever see. That morning was coming, and when it came, Cora Ashby would have to decide once and for all what kind of woman the Laughing Valley had so badly underestimated. The spring kept flowing in the dark behind her, patient, waiting, just like the man who had come to want it. The morning the spring ran muddy, the world was still and cold and gray. Cora came out of the cabin the way she came out every morning, with a bucket in her hand and the day's work already turning over in her mind. And she stopped. She stopped so suddenly that Boone, ambling along behind her, nearly walked into her back, because the water was wrong. The silver blue spring, the clear and patient water that had run clean through every season she had known it. It was brown, thick and churned and ugly, the color of stirred-up mud, sliding down over the pale rock and clouding the basin below until she could not see the bottom of it at all. For one terrible heartbeat, the old fear reached up and grabbed her by the throat. The curse! The word came whole and unbidden, the way the valley's words always came creeping in when a person was tired and alone. Maybe they were right after all. Maybe a place can only stay kind for so long. Maybe it turned on you the way everything else has turned on you. But Cora Ashby had spent a whole long season learning not to listen to that voice. She had learned it on her knees in the dirt, watching her plants die and refusing to blame a ghost. So she did the same thing now. She knelt down at the edge of the muddied basin, and she made herself look. She looked the way Hazel had taught her, not with fear, with her eyes. And what her eyes found was not a curse at all. The mud was not rising up out of the rock from below. It was washing down into the basin from above, from the bank, from a place where the soft earth had been freshly turned and broken and shoved down into the clean flow. The grass along the bank was bruised, flattened, trampled, and there, pressed deep into the wet ground at the water's edge, were the marks of boots. Boots that did not belong to her. Cora crouched there a long moment in the cold gray light, and she felt the fear drain slowly out of her and harden into something colder. The spring had not turned on her. A man had. She knew whose hand it was. She did not need a name carved in the mud to tell her that. A farm like this attracts attention, and attention has a way of becoming difficult. She heard the words again, spoken in that easy, gloved, untroubled voice. A man drawing his fine gloves on, finger by finger, while he threatened a widow on her own land. So this was what difficult looked like. It looked like a man too proud and too cowardly to do his own digging, sending others out in the dark to foul the water of a woman who had dared to tell him no. Cora stood up slow. She did not weep over it. She did not rage. She had buried a husband and lost a home, and she had learned that rage is a fire that eats the one who carries it. She picked up a shovel instead, and she went to work. She cleared the broken bank. She hauled stone, and she packed earth. And she built that bank back up firm and clean, so that no man's midnight mischief could wash it down into her water again. Then she let the spring run. That was the thing about clean water. Given time, given patience, it flushes itself clear. It carries the filth away and forgets it ever came. She watched it run all that morning. Brown, then clouded, then clearer, then clear. By the middle of the day, the basin was silver again. By evening, you could not have told that anything had happened there at all. But Cora knew. And now she understood the true shape of the thing she was up against. It was not a ghost. It was not a curse. It was not even, when you came right down to it, a fouled bank and a few muddy boot prints. It was fear. A man was spending fear the way another man spends money, and the whole frightened valley was spending it right alongside him, without ever once stopping to ask whose pocket it all was filling. Because the muddied spring was only the beginning of it. The words came faster after that, and meaner. Somebody said cattle had taken sick from drinking that water. Nobody could say whose cattle, or when, or where. But the word was loose now, out in the open air, and a word like that does not need to be true to do its work. Or a week later, somebody else swore the unnatural harvest was bleeding the very life out of the soil, and that the whole place would be a dead and barren ruin inside a few short years. And then came the oldest words, the darkest ones, the ones the valley had been whispering for a generation. The farm was cursed. The spring was unnatural. They had ignored the warnings for far too long, and now here was the proof of it, and they should have known better all along. Nobody could say where the rumors had started. That was the worst of it. That was their cruel and slippery strength. They had no father, no source, no single face a person could stand in front of and argue with. They simply drifted, porch to porch, mouth to mouth, growing a little larger and a little uglier with every single retelling, the way a snowball grows rolling down a hill. And Cora felt the weight of them long before she understood the cause. The orders grew smaller. The eager customers who used to come at dawn stopped coming at all. Good crates of produce sat untouched on Harlan Webb's porch until the beans went soft and the corn dried out, while the woman who had grown them stood by, helpless, unable to understand why. One gray afternoon, Harlan Webb stood beside a row of unsold pumpkins and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't like this," he admitted. He could not quite bring himself to look at her when he said it. "Folks are spooked. I don't know what I can do about spooked." Cora did not like it either, because here was the thing she could not get past. The thing that turned over and over in her mind all the long ride home that evening. The harvest had not changed. The crops had not changed. The spring had not changed by a single drop. Only what people believed had changed. And that was a far, far harder thing to fight. Facts a person could measure. Cora had spent a whole season learning how to measure facts, how to write them down, how to trust them. But fear could not be measured. It could not be dug up by the root and laid out in the sun to be examined. It simply spread in the dark, in the quiet, from one frightened heart to the next. And there is no shovel in all the world that can dig fear back out of a person who has decided to hold it. For a few long days, Cora did not know what to do. She sat at her cabin table in the lamplight with her ledgers spread out before her. All those careful columns, all those honest numbers, a whole year of patient work, and she understood with a sinking heart that none of it would save her now. You cannot hold up a column of figures to a frightened neighbor and watch the fear melt off their face. It does not work that way. It never has. Fear does not live in the head, where numbers live. Fear lives somewhere deeper, somewhere older and harder to reach. And Hazel's voice came to her then, soft, drifting up across all the years between. You cannot argue a body out of a fear, child. You never could. The more you push, the harder they hold. Cora sat with that a long while, in the lamplight, listening to the spring run on outside in the dark. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. If she could not argue them out of it, then she would not argue at all. On the first cool Saturday of the season, Boone pulled a wagon into town. But it was not a wagon of goods to sell. It was loaded with pumpkins and beans and corn and small jars of dark sorghum syrup that caught the light like amber. And alongside all of it, riding in the wagon bed, sat several wooden buckets, filled to the brim with water carried straight up from the silver-blue spring. People noticed at once. By the middle of the morning, a crowd had gathered near the center of town, drawn by curiosity and dread in equal measure, the way crowds always are when they sense something is about to happen. Cora climbed up onto the back of the wagon. She looked out over the faces. Faces she knew. Faces that had once stood at her fence in wonder, and now would not meet her eye. And she did not give a speech. She did not defend herself. She did not name the man who had fouled her water in the dark. She did not point a single finger at a single soul in that whole crowd. She simply began handing out food. No charge, no words. She held out an ear of corn, a slice of bright pumpkin, a spoonful of that dark, glowing syrup, and she waited to see who among them would be brave enough to take it. Some refused outright. They stepped back and pulled their children behind them, as if the food itself might bite. But some accepted, carefully, the way you take a thing from a stranger on a lonely road. An old woman tasted a spoonful of the sorghum syrup, and her tired eyes went wide, and then they went soft. And something in her face that had been closed for a long time opened up a little. A farmer broke open an ear of corn and turned it in his rough hands, studying the long, straight rows of kernels, before he finally raised it and took a slow bite. The children needed far less convincing than the grown folks did. They always do. They came forward eager and unafraid, holding out small hands, and they ate. And then Cora reached down into the wagon bed, and she picked up one of the water buckets. The talking around her grew quiet. Then it stopped altogether, because every soul standing there knew exactly where that water had come from. They had heard the stories, the sick cattle, the cursed flow, the poison hiding somewhere down in the silver blue. Cora said nothing at all. She dipped a plain tin cup down into the bucket, and she drank. The whole crowd watched her throat as she swallowed, watched her face, waited for it, the wince, the cough, the first sign of the curse taking hold. Nothing came. So she dipped the cup a second time, and she drank again, slow, calm, unhurried. The way a woman drinks water from her own good well on an ordinary afternoon, with nothing in the world to fear. Nothing dramatic happened. No challenge was thrown down. No argument made. The whole demonstration unfolded in the most ordinary way imaginable. She ate the very same food she had been trying for weeks to sell them. She drank the very same water they had whispered she was poisoning her neighbors with. And that was all. There was no magic in it. That was the point. There had never been any magic in it. Then Boone, who had been standing patient at the hitching rail through all of this, decided he was thirsty too. The old mule ambled over, slow and unbothered, and lowered his great gray head down into one of the buckets, and he drank, long and deep, the way he had drunk on that very first evening, when the two of them first walked up a muddy road with nowhere left to go. He had never once believed the stories, and now, in front of the whole town, neither did they. A few people laughed at that. A soft laugh. A real one this time. Not the pitying laugh of the men by the stove, all those long months ago. A warm laugh. A human one. And just like that, the tightness in the air began to loosen. Then something happened that no speech on earth could ever have bought her. A small boy near the front had taken a slice of pumpkin. He ate it fast, the way small boys eat everything, and got it all over his chin. And then he looked at the slices still laid out on the wagon bed, and he held out his hand. "Can I have another one?" His mother started to object. Her hand came up. The word was already half formed on her lips. The no that mothers keep ready. And then she stopped. She looked at her boy, happy, whole, healthy, reaching for more. She looked at the food. She looked at the woman standing in the wagon, who had eaten it and drunk the water and stood there plain and alive in front of all of them. And she let her hand fall. The crowd saw it. Every single soul there saw it happen. So did Cora. Sometimes the great tide of what a whole people believe turns on some enormous and shaking event. And sometimes it turns because a hungry child, in front of everyone, asks for a second piece of pumpkin, and his mother does not say no. The rumors might have dragged on for years. They might have if the story had stayed locked up inside that one small valley. But the story did not stay. Word of an impossibly rich farm, built around a spring the locals swore was cursed, traveled out and out and out, farther than anyone had ever meant it to go. And in time, it reached the ear of a man named Theodore Hale. He was a naturalist, a man who studied soils and waters and the slow growing of things. A man who traveled about the country giving lectures on what he had learned. He was, in other words, a man who had spent his whole life on the far side of the very wall that fear builds. He did not believe in curses. He believed in measurement. And a farm that produced what this one was said to produce was a thing he simply had to see with his own eyes. He arrived with notebooks and glass sample jars and a wagon nearly buried beneath measuring instruments of every shape and kind. He had little interest in the stories, none at all in truth. He wanted data. For 3 full days, the man went over nearly every inch of the property. He drew water up into his little vials and held them to the light. He scooped soil from this field and from that one into small labeled sacks of cloth. He filled page after page in his careful, cramped hand, laying her planning records beside her rainfall notes, beside her harvest yields, hunting for the thread that tied them all together, and Cora walked the rows beside him, answering his questions, handing him pages from Aunt Hazel's old ledger when he asked, watching this calm stranger measure with his fine instruments the very things her aunt had taught her to read long ago with nothing but her senses. It was a strange thing to see her whole hard season turned into numbers in a stranger's book. But it was not, she found to her surprise, an unwelcome thing. It felt almost like being believed. What impressed the man most was not the size of the harvest. It was the steadiness of it. The same advantage showing up again and again and again. In the corn, in the beans, in the pumpkins, in this field and in that one. At the green start of the season and at the heavy end of it. Not luck. Luck is never steady. Luck comes and goes like weather. This was something else. Something that worked the same way every single time you looked at it. And on the second afternoon, he turned his attention at last to the spring itself. And that was when he found the one thing not a single soul in that whole valley had ever thought to look for. He lowered a thermometer down into the flowing water. He read it. He frowned. He drew it out and lowered it again and read it a second time and then a third, just to be sure. The spring was warmer than it had any right to be, not warm to the touch, not steaming in the cold, nothing that a frightened person would ever notice or think twice about. Just a few quiet degrees warmer than every other water source in that whole part of the country had any business being at that time of year. A small thing. The smallest thing. But Theodore Hale had spent his whole life learning that the small, steady things are very often the ones that explain absolutely everything. That evening, the two of them sat outside the cabin while the last of the light died slow behind the pale bluff. His notebook lay open across one knee. For a long moment he said nothing. He only watched the thin ribbon of water slipping out of the rock, catching the last of the day, and giving back its strange and gentle blue. Then, quietly, he closed the book. "You did not discover a miracle, ma'am," he said. Cora waited. He nodded toward the spring. "You discovered a system. The water was rich," he told her, drawn up warm through limestone on a long, slow journey underground, and the warmth and the minerals and the stone and the soil all worked together, each one feeding the next. None of it by itself was a wonder. The way it combined was the wonder. And then he was quiet and let her sit with it. A system. She had spent a whole year calling it a feeling, a hunch, a thing she half believed and was half afraid to say out loud. Now it had a name, and somehow the name made it hers. Not a gift dropped in her lap, not a haunting she had stumbled into. A thing she had earned, season by season, by paying attention when no one else would. The haunted farm was not blessed. It was not cursed. It was simply understood now. Understood better than it had ever once been understood in all the long, fearful years folks had spent walking wide around it. That brought Cora a deep and quiet peace. But a theory written down in a traveling man's notebook cannot shield a living crop from the world. And the proof of his words was already coming. It was coming sooner than anyone in that valley was ready for. The chill came one night, all at once, the way the hardest things in this life so often do. It came down out of a clear and starry sky, silent, while the whole valley lay sleeping in its beds. And by the gray of the next morning, a hard white frost lay over everything. The valley woke to ruin. Folks stepped out of their doors to find their gardens silvered and stiffened and dying. Bean leaves hung limp and blackened on their vines. Pumpkin patches turned dark and soft along every edge. Corn that had stood green and proud the evening before now stood brittle and broken in the pale and pitiless light. The cold had come early, far too early, long before its proper time, and not a single soul had been ready for it. Cora walked her own fields in the first thin light, her breath clouding white before her face. The damage was there. Of course it was. The cold spares no one entirely, and she had never been such a fool as to think it would spare her. But the ruin was uneven. Strangely, stubbornly uneven. The worst of it lay up high, on the higher ground, far from the bluff, where the old upper plot had always struggled to keep pace. But down close to the silver-blue spring, down where the corn stood tall and the great pumpkins lay heavy and golden on the earth, many of the rows had come through the night. Bruised, yes, touched by the cold, yes, but standing, alive. A thin mist still drifted above the warm, flowing water, and the ground all around the basin had not chilled as hard or as fast through the long, cold night as the rest of the frozen valley had. Just a few degrees of warmth. That was all it had taken. The very thing a traveling man with a thermometer had measured and frowned over and named only a few short days before. And standing there in the killing frost, looking out over her own living fields, Cora understood at last just how much a small thing could come to mean on the one single night that it mattered most. By midday, folks were riding out from every corner of the valley to look at the ruin, and what they found waiting for them out at the haunted farm only deepened the unease already coiling through their hearts. Fields that should, by all rights, have died the very same death, had not died the same death at all. Near the spring, the corn still stood. The pumpkin vines still held their stubborn, impossible green. Whole long rows of beans looked weeks away yet from the collapse that had already taken everything they owned. For a whole generation, the valley had pointed at this place as a warning, a thing to fear, a thing to avoid. And now, on a cold and silent morning, the world itself seemed to be standing up and pointing the other way. The frost had touched every last farm in the valley. But when the cold finally lifted and the weak sun came creeping back, it was the haunted farm that was left still standing. The frost did what all the rumors in the world never could. It made people pay attention, and it made one man, watching it all from the warmth of his fine house at the far end of the valley, decide that his long season of patience was finally over. Within the month, Roland Crane brought the law down on Cora Ashby's head. He filed a claim against her, a claim on the spring itself. The water, he argued, came up out of the ground from a source that began far beneath land that he owned, up along the ridge. And if a man could only prove that the water was rightly his, where it began its hidden journey, then surely, he said, the water was his where it ended too. The whole valley took sides over it. Some believed Crane was only protecting what was honestly his own. Others, quieter, kept their thoughts behind their teeth and suspected the truth, that he had simply waited, patient as a spider in a corner, until the cursed and worthless farm became a thing worth taking. And then, only then reached out his hand to take it. The hearing was set for the county courthouse not long after the killing frost. The room smelled of lamp oil and old paper and the damp wool of too many crowded coats. Maps covered one long table. Survey records covered another. Bottles of ink stood in neat rows beside stacks of legal papers thick enough to bury the plain truth entirely beneath their sheer dead weight. Roland Crane arrived with surveyors at either side of him and property maps rolled up under their arms and a careful, polished argument all prepared and ready. He arrived with everything that money could possibly buy. Cora Ashby arrived alone. She brought no lawyer. She had none. She could afford none. She brought only her records, her weathered, faithful harvest ledgers, and the strange, hard-won, quiet confidence of a woman who has tested the very same truth, with her own two hands, over and over and over, through a full turning of the seasons. She brought the truth. And now she was about to learn whether, in this world, the truth would be enough. For hours, the men talked. They talked of boundaries, and of water rights, and of lines drawn on old maps by surveyors long since dead and buried. They examined faded markers. They compared yellowed deeds. They pointed at lines on aging paper as though the lines themselves might somehow speak up and settle the matter. And then Crane surveyors brought out their map, a fine map, a convincing one. It showed the spring's hidden underground source, rising clear and certain beneath Crane's own ridgeland. It was drawn with bold and confident strokes and stamped with official-looking marks. And to a crowded room full of tired and worried farmers, it looked very much indeed like proof. But Cora had spent a whole year learning to look closely at things, to distrust the easy story and check it against the patient ground. And as that fine map was laid out and explained, she felt a cold and certain knowledge settle deep into her bones. The map was wrong, not mistaken, not honestly in error. Wrong. The lines on it did not match the land she walked across every single day of her life. The slope of the country was drawn where no such slope existed. The water was shown running uphill against the very grain of the earth in a way that no honest water had ever run since the beginning of the world. It was not a survey at all. It was a story, dressed up in fine clothes to look like a fact. And Cora Ashby, of all the souls in that crowded room, knew exactly the difference between a story and a fact. When her turn came at last, she did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. She laid her ledgers open on the table. Before the judge, before the crowded, breathless room, before Roland Crane and his fine paid surveyors. And she let the numbers speak for her. She had written down everything, every rainfall, every careful measurement, every single day the water had risen and fallen in its basin. She had tracked the flow of that spring through the wet seasons and through the dry ones, through the killing frost and through the long, warm heart of the year. And the record of the water's own honest behavior, written down plain over a full turning of the seasons, did not match Roland Crane's pretty map. It could not. The water did not move the way his map swore up and down that it moved. It could not possibly have come from where his surveyor so confidently claimed it came. The land itself, measured and written down by one patient woman's faithful hand, was calling the rich man's map a lie. She did not say the word lie. She did not have to. The ledgers said it for her, in column after honest column, and the whole room could read it plain. And the courtroom grew very, very quiet. Then the traveling man, Theodore Hale, took the stand. He did not speak of curses. He did not speak of old stories or older fears. He spoke, as he always did, of stone and water and measurement. Using his own field notes and the samples he had drawn with his own hands, he explained how the spring rose up out of the limestone beneath the haunted farm itself. Water might travel far in the dark, he said. It might begin its long journey miles and miles away, deep underground, where no man living could ever follow it. But ownership of water was not decided by where it hid in the darkness. It was decided by where it surfaced, where it came up into the light and became a thing a person could see and touch and use and tend. And this water surfaced on the land of Cora Ashby. His measurements agreed with her ledgers, point for point. The two records, made by two different hands for two different reasons, told the very same story. And that is how a person knows, in this world, that a thing is true. When it holds up, no matter who does the measuring. The judge, a careful and patient man named Greer, listened to all of it, to the surveyors and their bold, fine map, to the widow and her plain, honest ledgers, to the traveling man and his stone, and his water and his calm, certain voice. When the last word had been spoken, the whole courtroom held its breath. Judge Greer looked over the maps one final time. Then he set them all aside, the true and the false alike. He looked at Roland Crane. He looked at Cora Ashby, standing alone with nothing but her ledgers. And finally, he looked down at the simple drawing that showed the one thing in all of it that truly mattered. The single place where the silver blue spring came up out of the rock and into the daylight. The water may travel in darkness, the judge said. His voice was slow, and it carried to every far corner of that crowded and silent room. But the law concerns itself with where it enters the world. He paused, and then he spoke the words the valley would go on repeating for years and years to come. The spring belongs to the land where it first sees daylight. A murmur swept through the gallery like wind through a wheat field. The ruling was plain. There was no mistaking it, no twisting it, no burying it under any stack of fine paper. The silver blue spring belonged to the haunted farm. It belonged to the woman who had paid $15 for ground that nobody on earth had wanted, who had listened to it, and tended it, and told the plain truth about it, when a rich and powerful man tried to bury that truth beneath a forged map and a mountain of legal paper. For the second time in that one hard season, a thing the whole valley had believed was tested out in the open, in front of everyone. And for the second time, the truth survived the testing. Roland Crane gathered up his surveyors and his fine forged maps, and he walked out of that courthouse without a single word. But Cora saw his face as he passed her by. The easy smile was gone from it. The patient, untroubled confidence was gone from it. And what was left underneath, where those things had been, was something colder and harder and far more dangerous than either of them had ever been. She had beaten him, in the open, in front of the whole valley he had spent his entire life believing that he owned. A proud man does not forgive a thing like that. He only waits. And so, as Cora rode home that evening behind her old gray mule, with the deed to her spring safe once more in her coat pocket, and the eyes of the whole astonished valley upon her, she felt no triumph. She felt only the cold and quiet certainty of a woman who has won one hard battle, and knows deep in her tired bones that the war itself is not yet over. The spring ran clean and silver behind her in the gathering dark, murmuring its endless and patient song. And somewhere, in a fine and silent house at the far end of the valley, a beaten and bitter man sat alone by his cold hearth. And he waited. He waited for the land itself to do to her what he had tried and failed to do with rumors, and with mud, and with a lie dressed up as a map. He did not yet know what Cora Ashby already knew, deep in her patient heart, that the land does not take sides. The land only tells the truth, and the truth was on her side. The drought came the way the worst things often come, not all at once, not with any warning a person could heed and prepare for. It came quietly, so quietly that at first nobody in the valley even knew to be afraid of it. The rains were simply late one season. That was all. Folks said it happened from time to time. Folks said it would break soon enough, that the clouds would gather any day now, the way they always had before. It did not break. The days went by, dry and bright and merciless, and the sky stayed a hard and cloudless blue, and slowly the talk in town changed. The easy talk of any day now became a quieter, more careful kind of talk. The kind people speak when they have started, in their secret hearts, to worry. The little creeks that fed the valley grew thin first, then thinner, and then they were not creeks at all anymore. Just dry beds of pale, sun-bleached stone, winding through the hills where running water used to be. A child could walk straight down the middle of them now, and never wet a boot. The ponds pulled back from their banks and left cracked mud behind, curling up at the edges like old paper left too long in the sun. And then the wells began to fail. The wells that had given freely for as long as anyone in that valley could remember. The wells their fathers had dug, and their fathers before them. One by one, they began to give less. A bucket came up half full, then a quarter. Then it came up scraping the bottom, with nothing in it but a swallow of muddy water and the hollow, frightening sound of a dry shaft echoing up from below. The valley that had once laughed at a widow with $15, and then come to fear her, and then dragged her before a judge to take what was hers, now found itself standing in its own rising dust, looking up at a sky that would not answer. But the silver blue spring kept flowing, not faster, not a single drop slower. Just steady, the way it had always flowed, the way it had flowed on that very first evening in another lifetime, when a tired and broken woman knelt down beside it and dared to lift the water to her lips. It did not seem to know there was a drought at all. It came up out of the pale rock, clear and cool and certain, as if it belonged to some other, gentler world entirely, and was only passing through this hard and thirsty one out of a kind of mercy. Cora stood beside it one breathless morning, watching it run, feeling the dry heat press down on the whole valley like a hand. And she understood, standing there, that she had come at last to the moment that would decide what kind of woman she truly was, because everyone wanted the water now. Everyone. And the water was hers. The law itself had said so. A judge had spoken the words out loud in a crowded room. The spring belongs to the land where it first sees daylight. It was hers to do with as she pleased. They came to her with money. More money than she had ever seen gathered in one place in all her life. Men who would not have tipped their hats to her a year before, who had crossed the street to avoid her, who had whispered behind their hands as she passed, now stood at her gate with those same hats held humbly in their hands. And they offered her sums that made her head go light. They came with land, good land, the deeds pressed into her hands before she could even refuse them. They came with livestock, and with wagons, and with jewelry that had belonged to their grandmothers. They came with promises, and with pleading, and with a desperation in their eyes that the drought had put there. Some of them were willing to pay almost any price at all, and no one on this green earth would have blamed her for taking it. She had earned it. Lord knew she had earned it. She had been laughed at and lied about, and had her water fouled in the dark, and been hauled before the law. All of it, every cruelty, just for the right to call this spring her own. She could have named her price. She could have made the whole valley pay, in hard coin, for every cruel word and every pitying laugh it had ever spent on her. It would have been a kind of justice. Instead, she opened the gates. She let them come, all of them. Boone spent his long days hauling water barrels into town, the old mule plodding patient through the heat and the dust, his gray muzzle nearly gone to white now, his steps slower than they had once been, but steady. He was always steady, that one, right up to the end. Families arrived from every far corner of the valley with their empty containers and their frightened, hollow eyes. Some of them had stood at her fence in wonder, back when the harvest first exploded. Some had stood in the land office and laughed when she set down her last $15. Some had whispered the rumors that nearly broke her, had crossed the street to keep from meeting her eye, had sat in that crowded courtroom secretly hoping, in the dark of their hearts, to watch her lose everything all over again. Cora served every last one of them the very same way. No ledger to mark who deserved it and who did not. No special rate for the ones who had been kind. No punishment for the ones who had been cruel. No grudge held in her heart against any soul who came thirsty to her gate. Just water, cold and clear and free. One hot afternoon, while she was bent over filling buckets beneath a hard white sun, she looked up and recognized a face in the long waiting line. A couple. Older now, the way she herself was older now. The years had marked them both. She remembered them. They had been standing in that land office all those long seasons ago, on the morning she set her last $15 down on the counter, and the whole room laughed. They had laughed too. She had not forgotten it. She remembered the sound of it, the way you remember the things that wound you. And now here they stood in her dusty yard with empty jugs in their trembling hands. And they could not quite bring themselves to look at her. They lowered their eyes to the ground. Cora filled their jugs anyway, all the way to the very brim. And when she handed them back, she did not say a single word about the laughing. She did not need to. She let it go. The water in their hands said everything that ever needed saying, and it said it better than any bitter words of hers could have. Around them, dozens of others waited their turn beside the spring, in the long, hot line that stretched all the way back to the road. The drought had become the harshest judge that Valley had ever stood before. A judge that could not be argued with or bought or lied to. And its verdict was one that no living soul could mistake. The farm they had all feared was now the one place keeping every last one of them alive. It was during those long burning days that Roland Crane's whole world quietly came apart. He had spent a lifetime collecting things, land and grain and power, and the careful respect of frightened men. He had measured his own worth in fences and deeds and the number of folks who tipped their hats when he rode by on his fine horse. But you cannot drink a fence. You cannot pour a deed down a dry well and bring the water back to life. When the drought came, Roland Crane found himself a rich man standing alone in a field of dust. He had more land than any soul in the valley, and not one dependable drop of water beneath any of it. He had power over men, and no power at all over the empty sky. His warehouses stood full of last year's grain, and slowly, as the cruel season burned on and on, even that began to lose its meaning. For what good is a hoard of grain when your own neighbors are looking past you, down the valley, to the widow who keeps their children alive with free cold water? The men who had once tipped their hats to him stopped tipping them. They tipped them to her now. Or they did not tip them at all, too tired and thirsty to bother with such things. And the influence Roland Crane had built, brick by careful patient brick, over the long course of a whole hard lifetime, simply dried up, the same way his wells did. Ownership, it turned out in the end, was a fragile sort of power. It was strong only so long as the whole world agreed to stay the same. But Cora had something the drought could not reach, and could not burn, and could not take. She had understanding. She had a year of patient, careful watching, written down in faithful ledgers stacked upon her shelf. She had learned how the water moved, and why it moved that way, and how to share it out among the thirsty without ever losing the source of it. She had knowledge, and knowledge, it turned out, was the only thing in that whole parched and dying valley that the sun could not burn away to nothing. It had cost her dearly to gain. A year of bent backs and aching hands, a season of failure on her knees in the dirt, a long fight against fear and lies, and a forged map in a crowded room. But once gained, it could not be unlearned. It could not be repossessed by any creditor's wagon. It could not be drowned by any drought. It was hers, the way nothing else in her life had ever truly been hers. One autumn afternoon, when the very worst of the drought had finally begun to ease its grip, a fine horse came slow down the wagon track that led to the farm. Cora knew the rider long before he reached her gate. Roland Crane. But not the Roland Crane she remembered. Not the gloved and easy man who had threatened her on her own land, who had named her attention difficult and ridden away, certain of his own power. Age had settled on him hard over that one terrible season. The fine coat hung looser on his shoulders now. The proud, straight back had bent, just slightly, the way a strong tree bends after it has weathered one wind too many. The confidence was still there, somewhere, down in the deep bone of him. A man does not lose that entirely. But the certainty was gone clean out of him. And riding beside him on a smaller horse was a boy, quiet, watchful, maybe 10 or 12 years old, with his father's sharp, clever eyes, but none of his father's hardness in them yet. None of that cold and patient hunger. A son. Cora set down her bucket and walked out to meet them near the spring. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. The only sound in all the world was the water. Always the water. Slipping over the pale rock, gathering soft into the basin, murmuring its old and patient song. The song that had outlasted the laughing, and the lying, and the lawsuit, and the drought, and would, she knew, outlast every one of them in the end. Finally, Roland Crane rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "He's interested in farming," the man said. That was all. Just that. Cora waited. She had learned the great power of waiting, of letting a silence sit until it filled up on its own with whatever truth a person was holding back. Crane's eyes moved out across the fields, green and living, where the rest of the valley still wore its coat of brown and dust. They moved to the spring, and then they moved at last, slow and reluctant, back to her. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the old sharpness, none of the gloved and easy menace she remembered so well. "He ought to learn it," Crane said slowly, the words seeming to cost him something. "From somebody who understands this place better than I ever did." It was not an apology. Men like Roland Crane do not give apologies. They have spent too many years being right and being obeyed to ever learn the simple shape of the word. But it was something rarer than an apology. It was an admission. The proud man, standing in front of the widow he had once tried to ruin, in front of his own watching son, had bent his stiff neck just this once and named her the wiser of the two of them. Cora looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She could have said a great many things right then. She could have reminded him of the mud in her spring, of the lie dressed up as a map, of the laughter and the rumors, and the long, lonely fight he had put her through. She said none of it. Instead, she looked at the boy, at the watchful eyes that had not yet learned their father's hardness, that might, with the right teaching, in the right soil, never learn it at all. And she nodded. That was enough. She did not gloat. She did not throw any of it back in the man's bent face, because she had already won the only victory that ever truly mattered. The drought had spoken it plainer than any judge ever could, plainer than any forged map, or any whispered rumor, or any ledger full of honest numbers. A man who only owned had been brought low, and a woman who understood was keeping the whole valley alive. The boy began coming to the farm after that, and Cora taught him. She taught him the way her Aunt Hazel had once taught a small barefoot girl, kneeling together in the dirt of another garden in a kinder and a gentler time. She taught him to read the color of freshly turned earth, and to know from it whether the soil beneath was thirsty or full. She taught him why the water moved through some channels willingly and turned its back on others. She taught him that every good harvest begins long, long before the first seed is ever dropped into the ground. And she taught him the very thing his father had needed a whole drought to finally learn, that owning a thing and understanding a thing are not at all the same, that a man can hold the deed to half the world in his fist and still know nothing at all about how to make a single bean grow. The boy listened. He had good ears, that one. Better ears than his father had ever owned. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he was truly looking, and not just nodding along. And Cora found, to her own quiet surprise, that there was a deep and gentle pleasure in the teaching of it, in passing on the things Hazel had given her, so that they would not die when she did, so that they would go on into hands young enough to use them for a long, long time. And in time, the haunted farm stopped being called the haunted farm. People began to speak of it by a different name. Her name, a name tied not to fear and not to any curse, but to the simple, stubborn, undeniable fact that things grew there, and that people had lived through the worst of the drought because of it. The old name faded, the way old fears fade, when there is finally something better to put in their place. But not everything in those years was a victory. There is always a cost to a life like the one she had lived. There always is. And it came for her, in the end, the way it comes for every one of us, not as an enemy at the gate, but as an old and faithful friend. Growing tired, Boone had grown very old. The drought had asked a great deal of him, hauling those heavy barrels of water day after day, week after week, under that punishing white sun. And though the rains finally came back in their own slow time, and the wells filled again, and the whole valley turned green and grateful once more, the old mule did not grow young again along with it. He slowed. He took to sleeping in the warm patches of afternoon sun, his old legs folded beneath him. His gray muzzle went all the way to white, and his eyes, those patient, unbothered eyes, went soft and far away, the way the eyes of the very old will go, as if they have begun looking at something the rest of us cannot yet see. Cora knew what was coming. She had buried enough in her long life to know the look of a thing that is quietly getting ready to leave, so she did not work him anymore. Not a single barrel, not a single load. She let him rest. He had earned his rest more than any creature she had ever known. He chose his own place to spend those last quiet days. He chose the spring. Of course he did. He would walk down there slow in the soft mornings, careful with his old legs, and lie himself down in the cool green grass beside the basin, in the cool air, with the silver blue water murmuring its endless song right beside him. The very same water he had drunk on that first far-off evening, when a frightened, ruined widow had watched a tired old mule lower his head to a spring that the whole world swore was cursed, and dared, for the very first time, to wonder if everyone had been afraid of the wrong thing all along. He had been there for all of it, every single part. He had pulled the wagon that carried her last few possessions away from a life that had been stripped from her by other men's mistakes. He had hauled the timber and the stone that built this place back up out of its ruin. He had carried the crops to town in the good days, and the water to the dying valley in the hard ones. And he had stood beside her, patient and unbothered, when the whole world laughed at her. And when the whole world finally changed its mind, he had stood beside her for that too. Now he slept beside the spring that had changed both their lives, the day they first walked up that long, muddy road together with nowhere left on earth to go. One still evening, Cora walked down to him, carrying a handful of the sweet grass he liked best. The light was going gold and soft over the pale bluff. The water caught it and gave it back, the way it always had, the way it always would. And Boone was gone. He had slipped away quietly in the cool grass beside the water he loved, with the last gold light of the day resting warm on his old gray hide. No struggle, no fear, no pain that she could see. Just gone. Cora knelt down, slow in the grass beside him. She did not weep loudly. That had never been her way, not once in all her hard years. She had done most of her weeping in private, in the dark, where no soul could see. She just rested her hand on his still neck, one final time, the way she had 1,000,000 times before, on the road, in the field, in the long, quiet evenings. And she let the silence hold her. The water murmured on beside her. The light slipped down behind the bluff, and an old woman knelt alone in the grass and said goodbye to the last living thing that had walked the whole long road with her, from the very bottom of her life, all the way up. She buried him there, beside the spring, in the soft grass he had chosen for himself. It seemed the only right thing to do. He had asked for so little, that old mule, in all his patient years. A patch of grass, a drink of cool water, a hand resting on his neck. The simple chance to be near the one person in all the world who had never once given up on him, in a world that had counted him worthless and very nearly left him behind in the mud with everything else. And he had given her everything in return. He had been the very last thing left to her on the day she lost it all. And he had stayed. Sometimes, Cora thought, kneeling there in the gold and fading light, with the fresh-turned earth beneath her aching hands. Sometimes the truest companions in this whole life are the quiet ones. The ones who do not promise and do not boast and do not ask for anything at all. The ones who simply stay, who walk beside you down the long, hard road, asking for nothing, giving everything, and never once turning back. The years went on after that, the way the years always do. The valley healed. The wells stayed full. New barns rose up where old, abandoned, weed-choked foundations had stood for a generation. Children who had once been warned away from the cursed ground at the end of the valley grew up now, hearing a very different kind of story about the place. And Cora grew older still. She did not build an empire. She had never once wanted one. Empires, she had learned with her own two eyes, are fragile things. They dry up and blow away the very moment the world stops being kind to them. She had watched it happen to a proud man in a single hard season. She built something quieter instead. Something that did not need the world to be kind, to go on standing. She built understanding. On warm evenings, folks could find her sitting beneath the broad shade of a great old tree near the fields, with the young ones gathered round her in the grass. The farmer's boy, grown taller now. Other children, drawn out by simple curiosity. Young farmers from neighboring places who had heard there was a woman at the end of the valley who knew things. Anyone at all who truly wanted to learn. And she taught them the way her aunt had taught her, so very long ago. Not lessons out of any book. Lessons out of the ground itself. That healthy soil breathes, that the insects will whisper a warning long before the plants ever cry out, that every season scatters its clues across the land for anyone patient enough and humble enough to gather them up and read them true. And one lesson more than all the rest. The one Hazel had worn so deep into her memory that it had become a part of her very bones. The land always tells the truth, Cora would say, her old voice soft in the gold evening light. And then she would pause, and the children would lean in. They always leaned in for this part. The trouble is, And here she would smile, that same sly, knowing, gentle smile she had carried with her all the way from a kinder time, through all the loss and all the laughter and all the long, hard years between. Most folks never stopped talking long enough to hear it, and the children would laugh. And somewhere down below the bluff, the spring would murmur its agreement, soft and endless in the falling dark. She never grew rich, not in the way the valley once measured riches. She never married again, and she never seemed to mind it, not for a single day. There was a fullness to her quiet life that needed nothing at all added to it to be complete. She had the green fields. She had the children who came to learn, season after season, carrying her aunt's old wisdom forward into a future she herself would never see. She had the spring, running on, clear and patient and free, the way it had run for 1,000 years before her and would run for 1,000 more. And she had the memory of an old gray mule sleeping in the soft grass beside the water, a faithful friend who had walked the whole long road with her from the very bottom of her life, all the way to the top. There had never been any curse on that farm. There never had been. There was only a spring, coming up out of the pale and ancient rock the way it had for longer than anyone could count, long before any frightened soul ever arrived to give it a frightened name. There was only a piece of honest ground, telling the truth, plain and patient, to anyone who would stop their talking long enough to listen. And there was only a widow, a plain, tired, stubborn woman, the kind the whole world likes to write off and laugh at and count as nothing at all. A woman who had refused, in the end, to fear the very thing that everyone else had simply never taken the time to understand. She had lost everything once, every single thing she owned, and the husband she had trusted, and the future she had been so sure of. And in the losing of it, in the long, hard, lonely climb back up from nothing, she had found the one thing that no creditor's wagon, no whispered rumor, no rich man's lie, and no burning drought could ever take away from her again. She had found herself, and on the quiet, golden evenings, beneath the great old tree, with the children listening close and the water murmuring its ancient song down below the bluff, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had ever needed, and she had built it, every last bit of it, with her own 2 hands, out of $15, an old mule, and a piece of ground that nobody else on earth had wanted.